I was going to talk about how I'm a seminary student, and I'm trying different things, like walking around. But I'm not going to try that right now. But I am still a seminary student, and living and going to school at seminary means moving and spending a lot of time with the sort of people who go to seminary. And since you don't know them before you go to seminary, you spend time asking them, how'd you get here? What led you to drop everything and move to somewhere like Dubuque, Iowa? And of course, that meeting and getting to know people happens anytime that you move to a new place. But at seminary, we have a special term for it. Instead of saying, what made you move here? We say, what is your call story? There's this assumption that to do something as crazy as give up your previous life and move to seminary, you must have a calling from God. Before you can be admitted to seminary, you need to write papers saying how it is that you think that you hear God calling you to take up a career of professional ministry. And as we talk about our calling from God, we look for examples of other times that God has called people. And two of those examples are in our lessons today. So first we hear about Samuel. Set the stage a little bit. This is sometime after the Israelites have left their slavery in Egypt, been brought by God to their homeland. But it's before the time of King David. In fact, the only reason we hear this story, the reason we hear about Samuel, is that later, in a few years, he will be the one who anoints David as king over Israel. But right now, in this story, he's a young boy, probably about 12 years old, and he's living and working in the temple. One way to describe it might be that he's an intern. And Eli, his supervisor, is the priest in the temple. And Samuel is doing this internship not because he has some great calling from God, at least not yet, but because his mother Hannah had promised to bring him to the temple. The first 2 chapters of the book are about Hannah and her husband's struggle to have children and her sort of negotiation and promise with God that if God gives her a son, she'll dedicate that son to the Lord. It's almost a little bit like baptism, as she brings her child to the temple and commits him to God. Anyway, one night, Samuel is lying down in the sanctuary, and he hears a voice calling his name. And naturally, he assumes that it's Eli. But Eli says it's not him. And this happens 2 more times, and then Eli, the wise supervisor, finally catches on that something else is going on here. That this voice Samuel is hearing is actually God. So he tells Samuel that the next time this happens, he should respond by saying, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And as I read this text, I noticed something interesting. Even after Eli tells him that it's the Lord calling, I think that Samuel is still a bit skeptical. Eli tells him to respond, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." But when it actually happens, note what Samuel says. He says, "Speak, for your servant is listening." He leaves out a word. He leaves out that word, Lord. And I think that might be because he's not really convinced who he's talking to. And we know that it's God calling, and Samuel does figure it out pretty quickly, but at that time of his first call, he doesn't quite believe it. He's not quite sure. So I think when we talk about call stories, about being called by God, this story is the kind of thing we think of. At least I do, and I suspect I'm not alone. When I think of God calling, I hear a voice from beyond calling my name. And somehow in my head, that voice always sounds like James Earl Jones, or maybe Morgan Freeman from Bruce Almighty. But this is the example we have of a call. This and stories like Moses being called in the desert by a burning bush and a voice. But that's not generally the way that God works. Of course, we believe that God can work this way, and I believe the story we just heard. But even the way that this story starts points to how rare it is, how extraordinary this calling is. Begins, the word of the Lord was rare in those days, and visions were not widespread. I wonder if you ever feel like that. Like we're living in a time when the word of the Lord is rare, and it's hard to hear. I've heard people talk about how they think the Old Testament, or maybe even the entire Bible, are not relevant anymore today. Well, I think that this sounds precisely relevant. The word of the Lord was rare, and visions were not widespread. The people maybe felt like they were under attack, like maybe faith wasn't as important as it used to be, like maybe God was less present than before. So I wonder if Samuel was looking for a call, or if he was just at church going through the motions because his parents, literally in his case, dragged him there. But regardless, God does call him, and God calls him in this dramatic, audible way. And sometimes that is the way that a call story happens. But what if we don't have that experience? What if you don't feel like you have a call story? What if you can't think of a time when you heard God speaking directly to you? Or even of a specific moment, maybe a conversion experience, something dramatic when you first believed in Jesus? Well, I began that first paper for seminary, the one about describing my call, with that fear. I started by saying that I've never heard a voice talking to me. I'd never seen a billboard from God, and as my pastor likes to put it, I'd never been hit on the head by a divine 2x4. I've never been woken up at night by a voice not from a person there. And I think that I'm in the majority, even for people here in a church, maybe even for people at seminary. And our gospel reading gives us another example of call, and maybe this one is more helpful, more relevant to us. Some of us. This story comes from early in Jesus' ministry, 2 days, it says, after he was baptized by John, when he decides to go to Galilee. And on the way, he finds Philip, and he says to him, "Follow me." And Philip does. And not in a follow me sense like Twitter or Instagram, but literally, he gets up and he follows him. But that's still a direct call from God, not really unlike Samuel's call. And then we hear Nathanael's call story. And he does not get a direct call from God. Instead, Philip finds Nathanael, and he tells him that he's found the Messiah, and it's a guy from the town of Nazareth, sort of this backwater place. Nathanael is skeptical, and he responds with one of my favorite lines in the entire Bible. "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip invites him and says, "Come and see." Nathanael's life changes because a friend brings him to Jesus. And maybe that is closer to how some of you got to be here in church this morning. If you didn't get a direct call from God, maybe you're here because someone invited you. And that's closer to my story, but I still have no memory of someone inviting me to faith. I'm what we call sometimes a cradle Lutheran. I was baptized on the day I was born in the hospital. So it's hard for me to describe a specific story of being called to faith. I've grown up in church. I don't have that specific conversion moment. And I'd bet that many of you here at St. Peter's Lutheran have a similar testimony of being baptized as a child, or being brought along to church by your parents, maybe whether you wanted to come or not. And it can be hard to see that as a call story. It can be hard to see growing up in church as a call or as a testimony, but it is. When Jesus talks to doubting Thomas after the resurrection, and Thomas says that he believes because he puts his fingers in the wounds on Jesus, Jesus says to him, "Do you believe because you have seen? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And I think that's a lot of us, maybe all of us. we believe that we are all called. In baptism, God calls us to a life of faith, a life of service to others, a life of following Jesus. We're called to be witness within our many vocations, inviting others to come and see. And God doesn't just call us in our baptism, God also calls us to baptism. Baptized or not, God is calling us to participation in Christ's body, the church. The participation that baptism really is a welcoming into. But God's call comes in many ways, and sometimes it is maybe a voice from heaven, but sometimes, usually I would say, it's more subtle. At baptism, our parents and our sponsors invited us to come and see. As a church, part of why we exist is to continually remind each other and to remind others, to remind ourselves to come and see. And a big part of my call story to ministry, to professional ministry, is the church, is others inviting me to come and see, to listen to where God might be calling me. So I invite you this morning to consider your own call story. It doesn't need to be dramatic like Samuel's, and it doesn't need to be a call to professional ministry. You don't even need to know where you're being called, where it's going. But what is God calling you to? Part of why call stories are hard, I think, is that we can be afraid to claim that we even have one. Like Samuel, we might not even realize that we're being called. We can think that we're imagining things, or that it's a coincidence, that we're misunderstanding where God's leading. We might be afraid of where we might be called to. But I believe that even as God calls us, God gives us faith to respond to that call. And that faith is trusting when we're afraid to follow. Sometimes we avoid following or listening for fear of where we might be led. Sometimes for fear that we might not be led anywhere. Even for fear that there might not be anyone calling. For fear that if we were to stop and listen, we might not hear anything. But to that, God says, do not be afraid. God says, I have called you by name, and you are mine. Jesus promises, I am with you always to the end of the age. The one who calls us is faithful. And we can respond with Samuel, here I am, speak, for your servant is listening. Amen.